Welcome everyone, Costin here with my campaign guide for the Warriors of Chaos and Champions of Chaos in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. The Warriors of Chaos are the strongest race currently in Total War Warhammer 3. There are a number of factors that do contribute to this situation. First off, there is their recruitment. Their recruitment works differently than anyone else. So whereas most races just recruit units, right, from dependent on the structures that they have, the Warriors of Chaos can recruit units from a pool, from a warband recruitment pool. And this can include a large number of units, but it does depend on the region you're in. Corruption matters, whether or not you have corruption of siege, undivided corruption, all those kind of things do matter. By default, you may only have some things like a few things like Marauders and Chaos Warhounds, but you can get to fairly high levels. So, for instance, over here to the north, if I recruit a Lord, I can get access to a bunch of things, including spawn of Khorne, Chaos Trolls, Marauder Horsemen, Marauders of Khorne, along with aspiring champions. And that's just one part of the recruitment. The other benefit that the Warriors of Chaos have is with unit upgrades. So you can dedicate units to specific gods, but beyond that, you can also upgrade units from, say, Marauders to Chaos Warriors into Chosen into aspiring champions, or from Chaos Warriors into Chaos Knights and get a great deal of power through that. This makes it far more useful. This makes units that you recruit from turn 1 very useful, because you will never replace them. You'll just really upgrade them. And this system is so great that there's a mod that adds it to other factions, and it's one of the most highly recommended mods for the game from my perspective. Now, that's one of the first benefits. The second benefit with Warriors of Chaos is how their settlements work. Now, for Warriors of Chaos, the vast majority of settlements on the campaign map are going to be minor tier 1 settlements with only one building slot. Then, however, they have the Dark Fortresses, specific settlements around the map. Many of them in the Chaos Wastes that I hold, for instance, over here, and in Norska, but also some around the map. A few in the Empire, a few in Cafe, that kind of stuff. Now, Dark Fortresses are amazing because they generate a ridiculous amount of income. So, for instance, Albion over here is generating almost 2,000. And that's not necessarily the best example that I can give. There are some even better examples of a Dark Fortress that you can get, provided that you do upgrade them. Actually, for instance, here, Valkia's former capital is generally generating almost 3,000. The way this works is you have one structure called the Treasure House, and this by default will generate a ridiculous amount of income. And also increase your post-battle loot faction-wide by 4% for each of them at tier 4, as well as income from sacking settlements by 4%. And this stacks with each Dark Fortress. But on top of that, you have some other benefits as well. For instance, you can get at tier 2 the Chaos Shrine, and you can upgrade it all the way to the Profane Sanctum. So you're looking at getting over a 50% benefit for this treasure house. Already at tier 4, it's at 55%, because you also have other structures as well that can increase your income from each building. So right now I'm at 55%. I can get to 65%, and that's just for one structure. And there's other structures as well that can give you some other benefits. Recruitment cost benefits, favor from all buildings, for instance, with a horse barn. Now, these structures, obviously beyond giving you the income benefit as well as other benefits, will add certain units to the recruitment pool that you have available. So for instance, over here, I can get some Chaos Warriors. Over here in Valkia's territory, I can get, I have the chance every turn of getting Chaos Warriors, getting a Chaos Giant, Chaos Troll spawn, Manticore, Marauder Horseman, all that. And once I get more structures, more units will be added to that particular pool. And that's just one way of handling recruitment. But yeah, Chaos Fortresses, Dark Fortresses are amazing. They're also amazing because they're insanely hard to take. Very rarely will the AI attack a Dark Fortress. The AI doesn't like to attack heavily fortified settlements. And Dark Fortresses are very difficult because the units inside them are pretty harsh to deal with. Like even early on, a low level one can have a very tough garrison to deal with. As you upgrade them more and more and more, they become even stronger. And then there is another way to recruit, and that's through the Gifts of Chaos. Or rather, the Gifts of Chaos that give you various benefits. So one of the benefits that Gifts of Chaos, various Gifts of Chaos give you is adding units to the Gifted Pool. Now, the Gifted Pool is a global recruitment system of demons, essentially. You can start with basic stuff like bloodletters, demonettes, plague bearers, etc. And then you can move your way up to every single demonic unit in the game, including the most powerful, like Great Unclean Ones, for instance, for Nurgle, or if we're looking at Khorne, we can get Bloodthirsters, Soul Grinders. Now, there's a lot to be discussed when it comes to the Gifts of Chaos, which one's the best, etc., but you do get a lot of benefits when it comes to unit recruitment, as well as significant faction benefits like 10-15% missile resistance and ability to shatter walls, making your army one of the best armies, or your army some of the best armies at dealing with sieges in the entire game, because you can break down walls faster than anyone else. Shatterstone can be used to bring down wall towers as well, if I'm not mistaken. And these gifted units, global recruitment pool, by default, with the exception of Be'lakor, you can only have 6 gifted units in an army, though Be'lakor has an unlimited number of gifted units in his own armies, faction-wide. So you have a faction that can get a lot of units very quickly. So you can recruit, although there's limitations with the recruitment pool, you can recruit half a stack, maybe even a stack of units very, very quickly if you're playing Warriors of Chaos, even if it's basic units, and then you can take those units and upgrade them as they gain more and more experience, and you can keep them going and keep them useful throughout the course of an entire campaign. Like for instance here, I have an army under Valkia. It's only got Marauders of Khorne right now, but once I can upgrade these guys to Chaos Warriors of Khorne and then Chosen of Khorne, and also of course upgrade these Marauder Horsemen, I will gain a great deal more power in this particular army. So it is a great way. It's scalability with armies as well. It's a great deal of power. Finally, there's the vassal system. As the Warriors of Chaos, you can vassalize a great deal of factions. For instance, if I got good enough diplomatic relations, I could vassalize the Fey Enchantress. I've already forced vassalized Bretonnia after declaring war against them. You can vassalize elves. You can vassalize humans. You can vassalize dark elves. Some factions you can't vassalize. So, for instance, lizardmen can't be vassalized.
Agents of chaos.
Though there's 2 ways of vassalization. There's of course the diplomatic option over here, which is available to a lot of different factions, though not beastmen, for instance. But it is available to a lot of different factions. But then, of course, you also have the subjugation system. The way that works is you reduce a faction to their last settlement, and when you take that over, you can subjugate them, which makes them a forced vassal. And that can work very well. For instance, in this particular campaign, that's how I vassalized Wulfric over here. Though, this in turn meant giving up a Dark Fortress to him. Who knows, maybe I could
What brings you here,
pick it up, assuming it wasn't its capital. Factions can't trade their capital, sadly enough. But I have been able to get a lot of vassals in this campaign. If we look at this is the list of vassals. Is very significant, and vassals can give you a decent amount of income. Over here in this campaign, for instance, I'm earning 14,000 from vassal tribute. There used to be an issue early on when Immortal Empires came out where there was a cap to vassal tribute, though Creative Assembly has since either removed it completely, I think, or they've significantly increased the cap. It might still be there. I don't remember exactly the patch notes. But it is quite possible to just make a vast empire across the world just through your vassals. Like, look at this situation. I've got Malekith, Hargonef, various Norscan factions, and I have alliances. Like, basically, a lot of the north is under my, or all of the north, all of the north and northwestern Chaos Wastes are under my control, as is a great deal of Nagaron by turn 60. It may take you a while to actually win the campaign, though. That is a bit of a weird one because it's not counting. It looks like it doesn't count it, but either way, it did. I did get the short campaign victory condition, but it might take you a while to win a campaign because vassals don't count for this to achieve the campaign victory. You're probably better off waiting for an endgame crisis to start. But you do have a ridiculous amount of power. Like right now, any faction I declare war on will, like, I could just let my vassals with their armies just deal with them. For instance, over here I'm at war with Kemler, but I've got 3 vassals, 4 vassals even, within striking distance. So we've got 2 minor Norscan factions. We've got Leon Kor and another minor Norscan faction, and they can do a lot of the fighting for me. And that is the power of the Warriors of Chaos in a nutshell. Recruitment, Dark Fortresses, upgrade to units, economy, and finally vassals. When it comes to Legendary Lords, you do have a large number of choices. I've done a whole video on this, but suffice it to say, the best Legendary Lords, generally speaking, are the undivided Lords of Chaos. So Archeon, Kolic, Sigvald, and Be'lakor. Each of the Legendary Lords of the Warriors of Chaos has a very different playstyle. Archeon, for instance, is very focused on getting a lot of vassals because he gets a lot of benefits research-wise and souls per turn from each vassal. Kolic is focused on getting a lot of vassals because he gets empowered by worship, becoming an absolute monster the more vassals you get. Sigvald is favors Slaanesh very heavily, so he gets a lot of benefits in terms of authority towards Slaanesh. Authority is something that affects each individual army, giving them benefits to certain units of a certain god, or undivided units. Be'lakor is focused on demons, so he gets all the Chaos god gift slots from the very beginning of the campaign, at least 1 each. He can corrupt human lords. He can also recruit an unlimited number of gifted units in his armies. As for the monogod specific legendary lords, well, I would feel like Nurgle is really strong, as is Khorne. Tzeentch and Slaanesh less so. Tzeentch because the gifts of Chaos that Tzeentch has aren't particularly great. Slaanesh because Slaanesh units tend to be actually weaker than some of the other ones. Like, when it comes to a choice of Legendary Lord, one of the things you should be concerned about is not just the power of the Legendary Lords, but who they're worshipping. The individual gods have their own research tree and don't have access to all the units like the Undivided Lords have. On the flip side, of course, they do have their own significant benefits. Festus, for instance, has Nurgle Plagues. Valkia is an absolute monster on the campaign map that's very hard to kill in individual battles, and she does get a lot of campaign movement range. Ranking-wise, here's how I would personally rank them, just in short. Archeon is the best because by gaining so many souls for each vassal, he can maintain more gifts of Chaos and get access to higher level ones far quicker. And because he has that research benefit, he gets a lot more faction power faster than anyone else. Like, he can get double, triple the research rate of anyone else. after Archeon, you have Be'lakor. The unlimited nature of his demonic units, as well as the fact that he does get the exalted versions of the units. So he doesn't just get bloodletters, he can get exalted bloodletters, which is something the others cannot. Now, it doesn't matter too much for the others, to be quite blunt about it, because it's like, do you really care about that? No, you might get Bloodthirsters, and you can still get Bloodthirsters as the other free, or in Valkia. But it can give him some benefits. Like, Be'lakor is focused on demonic units, and he does have that significant upkeep benefit faction-wide for demonic units, and he's pretty powerful in himself. So Be'lakor is the second strongest, and then it's a decision between Valkia and Kolic. Like, both are strong, both are really good in battle. Probably Valkia wins the number 3 slot, just because she gets that campaign movement range after winning a battle, and herself campaign movement range after enemy retreats from battle. So Valkia is an absolute wrecking ball. So yeah, Archeon, followed by Be'lakor, followed by Valkia, followed by Kolic, and then Sigvald, just because he's undivided. Even if he favors Slaanesh, which isn't great, but he's still undivided. Undivided is, in my perspective, generally the best. And that leaves Azazel, Festus, and Village. Festus is the best out of the 3 of them. Then probably Village in terms of like pure combat potential. And yeah, Azazel is probably the worst. Though, let me be very, very clear on this. None of these guys are weak in any way, shape, or form. You can play any of these guys and you will absolutely decimate your enemies, because Warriors of Chaos are just so far ahead. And all of them are very strong in battle. Every single one of them. The one that's actually weakest in battle on a personal level is Vestus, but it doesn't really matter because he has so many other benefits with plagues that it becomes absolutely ridiculous. Like, in terms of pure combat potential, yeah, Vestus is the weakest, but he's got more than enough tools to make up for that. And the others are absolute monsters to face in a battle situation. Like, if you're fighting Valkia in particular, or Sigvald, or Kolic, or Be'lakor, it is an absolute nightmare you can face in individual battles. Valkia in particular is really, really hard to kill in a battle. But that's about the legendary lords. When it comes to individual lords, regular lords for the faction as well as heroes, you only have 2 choices each. You get cast lords, cast sorcerer lords, and then for heroes you basically get the hero versions of those exalted heroes and cast sorcerers. Now, most of the time with a campaign, I would say that you want to focus on getting magic lords, and you might, as cast, you might want to get initially a magic lord. But then you're gonna find yourself in a campaign discovering that you're gonna get a lot more mages than you're gonna get the exalted heroes. And that's because the structure that gives you cast sorcerers is something that you want to get as soon as you reach tier 2, because it's gonna increase the favor from all buildings by 30%. Whereas exalted heroes require you to get this particular structure over here, which isn't gonna give you the same net benefit. You want the economic benefit from the Chaos Shrine, ultimately. So you might end up discovering that getting a bunch of Chaos Lords can be great if you want to have a hero or lord focused on melee. Now, leveling wise, it's fairly simple for both lords and heroes. Like for lords, Room Marcher into Dominating Presence, then you focus on 3 points and whatever you're gonna use for units. So for instance, I have an army here, and I got 3 points into Cast Vanguard. Though since I also have quite a few trolls in this army and Cast Spawn, I might want to increase the weapon strength for all non-demonic War Beast, Monstrous, and Monster units. Of course, you also got benefits to demonic units, all that. But the skill tree is very simple to understand, very easy to understand, and pretty straightforward. Beyond that, I would spend 1 point Room Archer, 1 point Inspiring Presence, 3 points in this red skill line. And then for a legendary lord, at the least, for a regular lord, you continue spending points. Maybe with a mage, you start getting their magic tree, all that good stuff. But with the legendary lord, I would save up until they're rank 12, so you can get access to their special skill line, and maybe get all of it at once. And then, of course, a balance between army skills, blue skills, blue skills, personal combat ability. But it depends on what you've got. So for instance here, Be'lakor has access to magic, but I'm not interested in using his magic because I've got the mage in this army. I don't need Be'lakor to focus on magic. I need Be'lakor to focus on being very, very powerful and having a powerful army himself. So I've gotten a special skill line, I've gotten armor, hard to hit, etc. For magic lords, it's pretty simple to level them. For melee lords, what I would focus skill-wise is thick-skinned is really good. 2 points, like once you've spent these 5 points, I would get 1 point in Infernal Champion, and then get points, 2 points in thick-skinned, 2 points in hard to hit, get Force Seeker, get Blade Shield, 2 points, 2 points Scarred Veteran, and then Deadly Onslaught, and of course unlocking everything at the top as it becomes available. So maybe once you reach level 10 or once you reach level 8, you might want to save up so you can get all of these skills at once, assuming you care about it, but you would want these special skills as well. For heroes, for melee heroes specifically, I do have one here. For melee heroes, for caster heroes, pretty simple, just spend points in the magic tree, maybe get some scouting if you want it. But for melee heroes, yeah, thick-skinned, 3 points, 1 point hard to hit, get Foe Seeker, then get some points Blade Shield, some points Scar Veteran, Deadly Onslaught. As for special skills, and of course get training whenever possible. As for choices here in the skill line, it depends on what you need. For instance, sometimes you may want to go with Cast Commander or versus Cast Strategist. Though early on I would focus on Cast Strategist because that 5% casualty replenishment is pretty good. Warriors of Chaos don't have any way to... don't have a hero with high casualty replenishment, but what they do have various ways of increasing casualty replenishment. And one of the main ways is from undivided authority on their lords. So dependent on certain statistics, research can also help here, but the way you build your heroes also does help. But dependent on statistics that you have, you can get a great deal of authority for one god or quite a few at the same time. For instance, Be'lakor, he gets all authority +2, undivided authority in his faction, but he also gets a bunch of corruption for all of the gods. But he is obviously going to have a lot of undivided authority because he is an undivided legendary lord. Now, the higher your authority, the more benefits you get. So recruitment cost benefits, casualty replenishment benefits, upkeep benefits, and warband upgrade cost benefits. Heroes can also be dedicated to... Heroes and lords can also be dedicated to particular gods to increase the authority for those gods. Or they may start out dedicated. For instance, Valkia here, she will have very high authority with Khorne. Sigvald will have a very high authority with Slaanesh. So you generally want to focus their armies on those kind of units. So Valkia, so Khorne hates Slaanesh, so Valkia is going to have bad authority with Slaanesh. You can confederate as the Warriors of Chaos, by the way. You can confederate other legendary lords, just go up, beat them up, and you can confederate them. So in instance here I have Valkia and Sigvald already in this campaign, and I might want to go get Festus, for instance, or Archeon, Azazel, etc. But yeah, there are... there's quite a few choices when it comes to that. Which gods should you go for? Well, that will tie heavily in unit recruitment, sure, because there are certain gods better than others. But for heroes, well, for lords, let's talk about that. For melee lords, it's pretty straightforward. You're either going to get Khorne or Slaanesh, or you can stay undivided. Regardless, though, if you devote yourself to a god, and the cost here will decrease the more you spend, the higher level you are when you do devote yourself to a particular god. But regardless, you can become a Demon Prince of Khorne, Demon Prince of Slaanesh, or an undivided Demon Prince. So that is very expensive, but lords and heroes do have an upgrade path, as do their units. Now for heroes, they can't become Demon Princes, but they can dedicate themselves to a particular god. But which gods are available? Well, for melee heroes, I do have one right here. For melee heroes, you do have either Khorne, for exalted heroes that is, or cast lords, you either have Khorne or Nurgle. Or you have for exalted heroes Khorne or Nurgle. For cast lords, and this is where it's a bit weird, you have Khorne or Slaanesh. Yeah, I know. It's a bit odd that those are the choices. Like, you don't get an exalted hero Slaanesh, that there's those kind of limitations. It is a bit of a weird situation, to be quite honest about it. Whereas your lords can be Slaanesh, the cast lords can be Slaanesh, but the exalted heroes can't. Mage-wise, it depends on their magic tree. So for instance, he's got shadows, he can be Slaanesh or Tzeentch, but he has death, so he can be Slaanesh or Tzeentch as well. Though, also I think, if I'm not mistaken, there is also the ability. I'm pretty sure that there are some other choices. Oh, there are choices for for lords. So mage lords. So if you recruit cast sorcerer lord, the path to glory is either can be, for instance, Nurgle. If you do that, though, of course, you can also get a cast sorcerer lord that has more choices available. So, for instance, over here, let's say I recruit one of metal, I can beat Tzeentch. It depends on your school of magic, but yeah, suffice to say, there's various choices. Which ones are the best depends on the army that you're gonna have. It's not just about the benefits you're gonna get for the lord or hero for a particular god. It's also gonna be a question of authority and how that's gonna benefit the army that you're gonna get. So that's gonna tie heavily into recruitment, of course. But it is a nice system that you do have ways to upgrade your heroes. You also got the boons of chaos, which you get if you complete certain challenges. So for instance, here I would get Warband upgrade cost minus 15% and unit experience for undivided units if I reach rank 15. If I finish my turn with 18 Winds of Magic, I get the Pendulum. For him, if I win a battle against any demon race, I get a unit of Cast Furies. If I win 5 battles, I get hit points and armor. If I use the sacrifice option, I get souls from battles, 10% income from post-battle loot. So they do have a great deal of lord and hero customization, even if they have more limited choices when it comes to lords and heroes than some other factions. When it comes to unit recruitment, you're generally going to recruit whatever is available. The higher tier the units, the more you want to go for them, of course. So for instance, in this army, I've gotten a healthy mix of aspiring champions, Forsaken of Tzeentch, Bloodletters of Khorne, Forsaken, Marauders, Marauder Horsemen, Cast Warhounds, Spawn of Tzeentch, Cast Spawn, and some Cast Trolls. But what units should you focus on? Now that is an interesting question. See, aspiring champions are pretty decent, especially if you can get them early on in a campaign. Forsaken, not too great, but certainly better than Marauders. But one unit that is certainly capable of punching above its weight, especially because you can upgrade it, are the Cast Trolls. So Cast Trolls are pretty good in melee. The two downsides is their leadership, of course, and their armor. But you can take them and upgrade them into armored Cast Trolls. Now these guys will have a ridiculous amount of armor. They still won't have really good leadership, and that is obviously going to be a problem in a lot of battles, but there are ways of buffing that up. So for instance, I have 3 units of armored Cast Trolls with Be'lakor over here that are now close to 70 leadership. Of course, that's because of the high unit ranks that these guys have managed to gain. But yeah, Cast Trolls can gain a great deal of power, especially early on. But later on in the game, of course, you won't necessarily want to use them. They don't scale as well as some other units, but they're a pretty good and effective early game unit if you can get access to them. Now, in terms of regular units, like infantry units, cavalry units, all that, you do have to talk about the warband system, and then of course there's the gifted units to mention as well to talk about. Now, when it comes to the warband system, you do have Undivided and the various gods. Undivided is pretty good. The only thing Undivided is missing is some special cavalry options that Khorne and Siege provide, like either Doom Knights or Skull Crushers. But outside of that, Undivided has it all. They've got good chariots, good infantry units, some really good infantry units, Chaos Spawn, and of course, aspiring champions. If you want to get aspiring champions, then you need to stick with Undivided units. You can't go back from a dedicated god to Undivided, I think. I'm pretty certain that's not the case. I can even test it out since I do have some dedicated units. Yeah, you can't switch back once you dedicate yourself to a god. The question is, of course, do you care about aspiring champions? Well, early on, not necessarily so. And you may not necessarily care about upgrading units all the way into aspiring champions, especially because they can be available in a lot of provinces pretty quickly. But aspiring champions with a bunch of research can become really good, because a lot of the research that you need to get in order to unlock specific gods in their units will also give significant benefits to aspiring champions. Like, for instance, the Searing Branding Iron, which allows me to dedicate units to Khorne, gives Frenzy to aspiring champions. Then there's, of course, some other benefits like Fear, Perfect Vigor, Immune to Psychology, Barrier, and so on and so forth. Various benefits that you can get for aspiring champions, making them significantly more powerful. But what units do you want to get? Well, the question is, what units do you want to upgrade? Well, for infantry, you generally want to get Chaos Warriors. You want to get Marauders and switch them up to Marauders with Grey Weapons if you're fighting a lot of melee and not so much ranged. Because, yeah, you can do that for a small cost just before a battle and gain an advantage. But when it comes to Chaos Warriors, you typically want to get Chaos Warriors with Grey Weapons. The reason behind that is they have really good melee statistics, though of course they're more vulnerable against ranged. If you're facing a lot of ranged, Chaos Warriors, regular Chaos Warriors, are a better choice because they do have that Silver Shield. But it's either Chaos Warriors or Chaos Warriors with Grey Weapons. Halberds are generally not great unless we're talking about a huge mass of cavalry or a huge mass of large units. But only in those cases. And then Chosen, Chosen Grey Weapons are one of the best infantry units in the entire game, even for Undivided. Now, as for cavalry, when it comes to cavalry, of course, going for Marauder Horse Masters and then into Chaos Knights is a really good choice, or you could go into Chariots. Though, of course, Charioteer is a technology that you need to unlock, and it's not necessarily a great technology as far as I see it. It may not necessarily be worth it, though there are, of course, some benefits you can get with this particular tree. The units you unlock will obviously depend on your research. I'm not usually too fond with chariots. Some chariots or some factions can work very well, but as Chaos, you gain a lot of power with your regular Chaos Knights, and you can, of course, upgrade your infantry, your Chaos Warriors, into Chaos Knights if you want to do so. You don't have to necessarily bother with Marauder Horsemen. And I'm not necessarily too fond about Chaos Chariots. The Gore Beasts can be pretty decent in their own right, of course, when it comes to the power that they do have available. Cavalry is particularly weak. As for dedicated gods, here's how to view dedication of gods. Like, obviously, if you're playing someone like Valkyr, Festus, you're gonna want to get Nurgle units. But Undivided units generally will do quite well, because it's the combination of having really good infantry and pretty decent cavalry. Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Siege, they have their pros and cons, but usually it comes down to unit availability. See, Khorne, for instance, buffs the melee power of units, but of course decreases, like if we look at this, the Mark of Khorne decreases melee defense, but gives them Frenzy as an ability, which gives them a lot of damage. The downside of Khorne is that he doesn't have access to the great weapons. Instead, he gets dual weapons. Now, dual weapons are pretty decent, but in a straight-up fight, Chaos Warriors of Khorne with dual weapons will generally lose to Chaos Warriors with great weapons, even undivided ones. So although Khorne can certainly hold their own, like, undivided Chaos Warriors can do better. And especially Chosen can do better. Though Khorne does have some great cavalry with Skull Crushers. When it comes to Nurgle, Nurgle doesn't have the same kind of great cavalry choices and has very limited chariot choices, but they do have the Chosen of Nurgle with great weapons. The Chosen of Nurgle with great weapons are the best Chosen in the game because they have more durability than the other Chosen, and they also have poison attacks. They're slower, sure, they are slower than other Chosen. They're the slowest Chosen, but they also have the highest HP and can reduce the damage of enemy units with those poison attacks. Slaanesh was considered a joke for a very long time, though they have thankfully fixed the Hell Scourges, so Hell Scourges now do actually have some armor piercing, but Slaanesh, if we look at Slaanesh, I do have an army of Slaanesh here under Sigvald. If we look at the Mark of Slaanesh, you get immunity to psychology, Strider, physical resistance, and speed. They're just not the best melee combatants, though they are the fastest. And Slaanesh does have fast Chaos Knights, but limited chariots, again, and only, and no special cavalry. That is the downside of it. Like, Khorne, at least, has core beasts. Like, Khorne, compared to Undivided, like, Khorne gives you a great flexibility, though, of course, he's lacking in those Chaos Warriors with great weapons. But does have a pretty varied roster as well. Nurgle has great infantry. Slaanesh and Tzeentch, generally not worth it, though you can get some Doom Knights of Tzeentch as opposed to having undivided ones. But usually speaking, undivided is really strong. Nurgle is really good for infantry. Khorne is great for cavalry. Tzeentch is great for durability, and Slaanesh is good for speed. Usually speaking, I would say focus on either undivided or Nurgle for infantry. For cavalry, you can get Khorne or Tzeentch, and Slaanesh is just not worth it. If you're playing Azazel, yes, of course you're going to get Slaanesh units, but that's because you also have special skill line, a special research tree, and various benefits that you don't get if you're playing undivided. But usually speaking, I would not necessarily bother with Slaanesh units, unless it's for like an army like this, unless it's like Sigvald, who's very focused on Slaaneshi authority, so it is worth it for an army like his to get. It is worth it to get a bunch of Slaanesh units just because he's capable of maintaining them far cheaper than he otherwise would. But in terms of pure power, Nurgle is the best infantry. Khorne or Tzeentch are the best cavalry. Khorne, I would actually say, wins the cavalry race because he does have those Gore Beast Chariots of Khorne, which can be really strong, really good. So Khorne wins cavalry, though Tzeentch is not necessarily too far behind with the Doom Knights of Tzeentch. But the issue is, of course, like the Chosen and Chaos Warrior options. Like Chosen of Tzeentch with Halberds, just not great units. Chosen with Hell Scourgers, not particularly great units either. Chosen with Nurgle great weapons, really good units to have. Though Nurgle does suffer when it comes to the cavalry department. As for gifted units, out of the regular demons, I would only bother with Bloodletters. Bloodletters are a really good unit that can pretty much kill any other unit early on in the game. Though they are vulnerable to a lot of range fire, so just be aware of that. But if they're vulnerable to range fire, so are all the others. Nurglings, Plague Bearers, Demonettes, Pink Horrors. They're not good units at all. Later on, of course, you do have access. Like, whenever you can get a Hell Cannon, get a Hell Cannon. So, for instance, over here, that's exactly what I'm working on, starting to get Hell Cannons. Hell Cannons are one of the best artillery unit in the entire game. Skull Cannons of Corn, less so, of course, but still your other artillery option, and you're always going to have limits in terms of how many Hell Cannons you're going to have just because of the way the Gifts of Chaos do work. Outside of that, many other units are not really worth investing into because you do have to spend souls, and souls are limited currency, and it might be worth saving those souls for upgrading your heroes. But you can, of course, get Chaos War Shrines. They do provide different effects. You should look up as to what they provide, though. Of course, like you should also theme around like what is your army gonna have. Like, is it an undivided army? Is it a corn army? Nurgle army? And dependent on that, you should choose what you're going to go for. But Chaos War Shrines can be pretty useful to have. Generally, I don't focus on them because you can only get them through Gifts of Chaos. And there's other more important things to potentially get. Though, you know, maybe getting one of them occasionally, especially if you're having a lot of souls. Now, in terms of the better units, the higher end units, because keep in mind, unless you're playing Bellicor, you do have a limit of how many gifted units you can have in army. In terms of the higher end units, I would say Bloodthirsters win hands down against everything else, really. Of course, Keeper of Secrets and Keeper of Secrets can be pretty good as well. Lords of Change, all that. They can all be pretty solid, but I think Bloodthirsters are generally your best choice. If you're going with Undivided, though, Dragon Ogre Shagoffs, really good as well. Cause Terror, great deal of power, significant amount of melee power. Though, yeah, I mean, Bloodthirsters, just flying, anti-large, it's monstrosities, really, really powerful, really, really strong. Though, of course, quite a bit expensive, though, not necessarily as expensive as Dragon Ogre Shagoffs, which are the most expensive of all of the special units. But yeah, early on, if you want to use any gifted units, I would go with Bloodletters, if you even want to use them. The other ones I would not necessarily care. And then eventually get Chariots, Hell Cannons, especially focusing on artillery, and then Bloodthirsters or Dragon Ogre Shagoffs, if you want to use them. Obviously, if you're playing things like Azazel or Village, you're going to be more limited. So getting those special demonic units can very well be worth it. But I would prioritize getting Hell Cannons as well in terms of the Gifts of Chaos. But recruitment for Warriors of Chaos, you don't necessarily have a lot of recruitment choices. You don't necessarily decide, oh, I'm going to recruit this army. But you do have a lot of upgrade choices when it comes to playing the Warriors of Chaos and focusing on Chosen with great weapons, Armored Chaos Trolls, Chaos Knights or Chariots, if you so desire, can be useful. Spawns are not so great as units, though they can do a lot of damage. So just keep in mind that they have very low armor. Even if they're unbreakable, they will take significant damage in battle. It can be worth it to have some Spawn of Tzeentch in particular because of that barrier, giving them some extra protection in a battle, just 1,000 points of barrier. We then get into the Gifts of Chaos. Gifts of Chaos cost souls to activate and then souls to maintain, so they can be pretty expensive. Bellicor starts with all the Gifts of Chaos, all the choices available from all the gods. If you're playing anyone else, you're either going to have limitations and have to unlock them throughout the course of your campaign. Sigvald starts with Slaanesh. Archeon does get more Gifts of Chaos, but more Undivided Gifts of Chaos. When it comes to Gifts of Chaos, Undivided is generally the best. You get Ruinous Bulwark, which gives you 15% missile resistance, which pretty important for a melee-focused army as the Warriors of Chaos, and also gives you Shatterstone in siege battles. Very useful, worth having pretty much all the time. Outside of that, many of the benefits here from Undivided are not necessarily all that great, with the exception of Hell Cannons, though of course you might need to maintain or swap in and out, because to unlock higher tier of gifts, you need to spend a certain number of souls. So if you want to get, you know, Dragon Ogre Shagoffs or Hell Cannons earlier on, then you're gonna have to swap the gifts in and out. Or you're gonna get them very, very late on in a campaign, which can be a problem. I would certainly say when it comes to Undivided, that obviously you want to have Shatterstone, Ruinous Bulwark, and then after that you want to get Hell Cannons as quickly as possible. Everything else is not as important, though, of course. Very late on, Dragon Ogre Shagoffs can be really, really good, but you do require to spend a fairly high amount of souls, and souls can be limited in a campaign. Now, as for individual gods, here's how I will look at individual gods. Nurgle is great for one reason and one reason alone. Not the units, though you do get some free, you do get some Nurglings with all the units, so you get 2 for the price of 1. You get a weak unit, but you can get quite a few Nurglings if if you're just limited in how many units you have in a battle. Bloom of Decay can be somewhat useful, but especially because it gives you 75 growth for all provinces, but typically speaking, as Warriors of Chaos, the bigger issue when it comes to upgrading your provinces is not growth, it's cost, because the cost for buildings is very high. One very significant benefit with Nurgle is replenishment in foreign territory. This is incredibly significant, especially as Warriors of Chaos, you may not be seeking to get a lot of territory, or you're only looking to get certain specific settlements. So having replenishment of foreign territory is an incredible boon. Outside of that, not much really to talk about, though. The hide one can be useful for that 20% missile resistance, because I believe it certainly stacks with the Ruinous Bulwark. So we're looking at, what, 35% missile resistance. I'm pretty certain that it does stack. And of course, otherwise you're just looking at unlocking certain units like Soul Grinders, Castword Shrine of Nurgle, all that kind of good stuff. But yeah, Undivided and Nurgle are generally going to be the best choices. What about Khorne? What about Slaanesh? What about Siege? Well, Khorne generally gives you units, as well as some benefits like armor for armies led by Khorne devoted characters. That can be great for say Valkia. That can be really good, or for Khorne Lords, because you might struggle with armor. Bloodletters can be great units, but they don't necessarily have the best armor. So getting that 10 armor can be pretty useful. Death's Bounty can give you a good amount of income from post-battle loot, though if it was income from sacking settlements, this would be amazing, but it isn't income from sacking settlements. Obviously, you get Blessing of Blood for Bloodletters, pretty solid. And if you get Summon from Beyond as an army ability, then that can be pretty good, but it is a pretty far down the research tree. Beyond that, though, the thing you're really looking to get over here is the Bloodthirster upgrade, though it is a very, very expensive upgrade in terms of the souls required to unlock it. And of course, Skull Cannons can be really good as well. Like, I'm almost here being able to get Skull Cannons. Like, Khorne is great for the units you do get. What about Siege? Siege is the worst of all of them. By far and away, the absolute worst. Outside of the units, which are not necessarily the best units available in the world, though Screamers can be pretty good as a flying unit. But outside of the units, you're not gaining some significant benefits. Tides of Magic can be great. However, you're increasing your miscast chance by 25%, so maybe not so much. The 25% barrier points, yeah, that can be pretty good. 35% research for 10 control, absolutely not worth it in any way, shape, or form if you are playing as Warriors of Chaos. You don't have a control benefit, generally speaking, but losing 10 control just for 35% research rate is usually not worth it from my perspective. Warp Flame attacks for all units with Mark of Siege could be decent in some situations, but I don't think that Siege Gifts of Chaos are generally worth it from my perspective. What about, and that leaves us with Slaanesh. Slaanesh can give you some really sweet benefits, in point of fact. You can gain 35% campaign movement range. Like, Slaanesh can give you huge benefits, but there are major drawbacks as well, as is Slaanesh's desire, so to speak. One really big benefit would be that 35% campaign movement range. But for instance, if I activate it over here, then you are going to pay a huge price for that. Another benefit that you can get with Slaanesh is to get 35% income from all buildings. So I guess you can make it work, but you're going to suffer in terms of control. Profit of pleasure can be great when you have very good control and you have the structures, but it might also cause rebellions, because that is a huge control downside if you're playing with Slaanesh. And outside that, the other benefits just are not necessarily worth investing in. Like, Nurgle is great because of that casualty replenishment. Slaanesh comes with a lot of drawbacks. Khorne is great for units, and Siege is pretty worthless when it comes to the Gifts of Chaos, from my perspective. Though some decent units, of course, some decent flying units from Siege, but in terms of faction benefits, not really worth it from my perspective. Finally, we get into the research tree. The research tree will look differently and will have different effects dependent on whether or not you're undivided or you're following a particular god. So Valka's trees, Village's tree, Festus's tree, they're going to look very different in this. But generally speaking, you're also going to have some of the same effects, at least for undivided. And one of the things you want to get early on is to get Infernal March. This will give you 5% campaign movement range, and you will be able to access it fairly quickly. You'll also get the Warband upgrade for Chosen by doing so, and then you might want to get a Warband upgrade for Chaos Knights. Now, Research Tree, there are pros and cons with different approaches over here, depend on what you're going with. Inscribed Chaos Armor can be really good because of that 10 armor for Chaos Warriors, Chosen, Chaos Knights, and Aspiring Champions. Though those are units that already have very high amount of armor, so 10 armor, does that matter all that much? Not necessarily so, and there might be bigger priorities for you to follow. But still, it does reduce the cost of Warband upgrades by quite a lot. You're not necessarily going to struggle paying for Warband upgrades. Generally speaking, Warband upgrades are fairly cheap. Beyond that, you are going to look to increase your maximum Gifts of Chaos, or to unlock gifts for different gods, dependent on who you are playing as. So you're looking at different kind of benefits. If you're focusing on a particular god, you're generally going to get authority for that god. So for instance, one thing I'm researching here is Khorne authority for each active gift of Khorne. That is a pretty solid benefit. And of course, the final research for Khorne would give me 1 Khorne authority for all armies, though it would also come at the cost of 1 Slaaneshi authority. So for instance, Khorne hates Slaanesh since Siege doesn't like Nurgle. So if you get certain research, you might sacrifice authority with their direct opposite, and you should be aware of that. When it comes to research, of course, Khorne does give you some nice benefits, but generally speaking, research-wise, if we look at the research tree here, a lot of it is not necessarily worth it. The final point is, yes, but a lot of these things are not necessarily worth it in terms of army benefits, though you're going to get some Nurgle corruption, Nurgle authority. And that does bring up an interesting point about different styles of corruption. If you're undivided, then of course your control is tied to undivided. But if you're following a particular god, like say for instance Azazel, his control is tied to Slaanesh. And there's different pros and cons dependent on, or different pros really, dependent on which god you're following. For instance, Khorne will give you a substantial melee benefit. Siege will give you an ammo benefit. Slaanesh will give you a substantial income benefit. Like, Slaanesh may not have the best army, but Slanesh does have some substantial campaign benefits, and Nurgle gives you benefits when it comes to plagues and when it comes to growth. And that's something you should be aware of when you're also researching certain technology. Though, of course, you want to have the corruption level. You want to have the corruption of what your main corruption type is, so you can maintain a high level of control. That is important. That is the main way you get control. There are, of course, some other ways of getting control, but the main way is to maintain a high level of corruption for your chosen corruption, like Korn for Valkia, Undivided for many of them, Slanesh for Azazel, Nurgle for Festus, Tzeentch for Village. But going back into the research tree, other things that might be worth it is to get engines of mass destruction very quickly. But you do have various choices here depending on what you want to focus on. A couple of things that are worth pointing out are like Soul Calling of the Weak. To get more souls from battle can be really good. Various other choices available as well. But yeah, you have the different gods, and then you have the central tree for Undivided if you are playing Undivided. If you're playing a dedicated god, much of this Undivided research is going to be in the trees, sure, but you're also going to have a bunch of dedicated god research there as well. Far more substantial than what is available here. It's hard to talk about the research because you would basically need to do individual videos for every single one of the gods. But yeah, just focus on what units you're going to use. Obviously getting campaign movement range and chosen benefits can be pretty good. Warband upgrade costs can be really solid as well. Hell Cannon benefits, always great to have Hell Cannon benefits. Hell Cannons are great units. Other things are not necessarily so important. Except for one thing, erection of ruinous monuments. This is one of the more substantial research options you can get for two reasons. It reduces the construction time for all buildings, but also gives you the ability to recruit chaos sorcerers in any settlement. This can be useful to get heroes quickly to a battle. So for instance, or you can get exalted heroes. So for instance, over here, if I get erection of ruinous monuments, with that technology, I can make the breeding grounds and get exalted hero recruitment over here, or get a chaos sorcerer. That's significant, especially later on in a campaign, as you're gonna move into territory where you won't have dark fortresses. You can still get recruitment, but you may also want to get heroes. Your hero capacity will be increasing at home, but this is a way of getting heroes on the front line if you want them. And that's all there is to say. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and I'll see you boys and girls next time.